welcome to the first program of our 31st year. And thanks for all your support.
The operating theory of the book is that the Marianas Campaign was the most strategic campaign of the war, and that, yes, on some level, once we had forced that gate, the war was over. There were enough people in Japan who believed that Premier Tojo was sacked with the fall of Saipan. The purpose of the book was to fuse all the elements of sea power and show them in strategic application. In the Marianas Campaign, for the first time, we have a number of firsts going on. We have first concentrated employment of underwater demolition teams. Why? Because Tarawa had been such a disaster. We have close air support closely linked to amphibious landings and operations. We've got surface warfare, we've got bombardment, we've got the old battleships with their high trajectory fire finding unique application in beating down a 30,000-man garrison in advance of the first wave. We've got carrier air power deployed decisively in the largest aircraft carrier battle of the war. We've got submarine operations actually tethered to amphibious operations. The exploits of the USS Kavala taking down Shokaku at the height of the Battle of the Philippine Sea showcases submarines not as freelancing marauders, but as part of the concentrated application of sea power, exercising sea control, and then finally enabling power projection in its ultimate form. So this is sea power crystallizing, fusing, coming together in an epic campaign, but it's finally through the action of Army air power that this campaign proves to be decisive. So all of that, everything I just gave you in that last minute and a half or so, forms the narrative core of this book. And it's an attempt to recast the story of 1944, 1945, away from the traditional liturgy of plotting marine invasions and kamikaze actions, and finally the atomic bomb coming from the rear area somewhere. It's an attempt to put the focus on that rear area and to show how strategically central it was, that you cannot understand the closure of the war in the Pacific without closely following what happened in the Central Pacific about 600 miles south of Tokyo in the summer of 1944. Okay? So this is the fleet at flood tide, and I hope these slides will now advance. The map of the Pacific needs no introduction in this room, but it shows the Central Pacific Drive, which had been game boarded in Newport at the Naval War College going back, we're really starting in practically 1909 when the Navy realized we're going to have to crash these gates in a war against Orange, the unnamed enemy that will be Imperial Japan in 1941. Admiral King had this all mapped out. He'd studied it, he'd exercised it, he'd fleet problems and so forth in wargaming. And so this is the Great Central Pacific Drive, which will stand in competition with MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Drive, famously up and down, or up the New Guinea coast towards the Philippines, General MacArthur's advance, and then we have operations of the Central Pacific Force, which becomes 5th Fleet in April of 1944 under command of Admiral Raymond Spruance. You'll see the location of the Marianas Islands in the box at center, blown out. Maybe you can make a little bit more sense of the lay of the land there, with the 3 principal islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, invaded in sequence in the summer of '44. From these 3 islands, we dropped the hammer on Japan in the form of the 2 atomic bombs, and it will be my thesis that both bombs were necessary to bring Japan to heel. So you can see the extent of Japanese expansion. This was from a Japanese strategic map. The Japanese National Defense Zone, September 1943, is when they created this dotted line on a map that showed what they considered their inner perimeter. They've long since yielded Guadalcanal here in the South Pacific. Halsey is rolling up toward Rabaul. Ultimately, Rabaul will be bypassed along with Truk. The Navy's climactic offensive will be the long-awaited Central Pacific Campaign. And so this kicks off with the seizure of Tarawa in November of 1943. And then in early 1944, we have the invasion of the Marshalls, which all of which is to set the stage for the climactic seizure of the Marianas, which kick off in June of 1944. So my treatment is going to crystallize around 3 principal operational figures, leaders who I think are underrated, not talked about enough, and not appreciated for their contribution to their respective operational arts, and also ultimately for the strategic windfall that that was given to this country through their accomplishments in the summer of 1944. Raymond Spruance, I find, just as there are music fans who usually fall on one side or another of this continental divide between the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, you've got naval history buffs are either Admiral Spruance people or they're Bill Halsey people. Halsey, famously profane, aggressive, always seeking the fight, quotable back home in the press, you can be counted on for these little epigrams like, we'd be happy to divide the ocean with the Japanese. We'll take the top and we'll give them the bottom. Became a celebrity back home for his, for the manner in which he roamed the Pacific with a threadbare aircraft carrier task force, or in the months after Pearl Harbor, striking the Marshall Islands and so forth. So he justly becomes this public figure of widespread affection and adoration and admiration. At Guadalcanal, he holds the line as theater commander in the first offensive campaign of the war when it really could have gone either way. So his accomplishments are there to be admired, and it will be those accomplishments, especially his performance in the South Pacific, that will get him awarded with the last 5-star billet the Navy's going to budget in 1945. So Spruance, in a sense, has always been in Halsey's shadow. He's reserved, he's quiet. He's a very disciplined habit of mind, would seldom come out of his thoughts, would seldom come out with the famous level of emphasis that Halsey was able to manage. Spruance was really an understudy to Admiral Nimitz, and as Halsey is holding on in the South Pacific, Spruance is back at Pearl Harbor as Admiral Nimitz's chief of staff. And it's interesting to look at these kind of personality clones in some ways. The gentleman at center, Kelly Turner, Spruance's amphibious force chief, was often seen for his blowtorch personality as a sort of junior Ernest King. Spruance is in a great many ways sort of an understudy to Admiral Nimitz himself for the way he dealt with people, for the understated way in which he dealt with controversy, and the very careful way he saw to military operational planning, really his great strength. So this book will be an appreciation of the skills and talents and physical courage even of Raymond Spruance. Turner is an interesting figure in his own right. John and I were talking this afternoon about how amazing it was that Turner was even permitted to have a job. He crashed through several barriers that would have stopped any number of, really anyone's career in any other time or place. The first one was his performance as war plans officer back in Washington leading up to the Pearl Harbor attack. It was through Kelly Turner's discretion that critical intelligence breakthroughs were not given to Admiral Kimmel at Pearl Harbor concerning, say, the so-called bomb plot message when American intelligence sources revealed the Japanese were actually reporting to Tokyo. Japanese human intelligence sources in the Hawaiian Islands were reporting to Tokyo on the mooring locations of American battleships in Pearl Harbor. Wouldn't you like to have known that if you're the commander of that base? Turner helped keep that information from Kimmel, and of course it'll be Kimmel's career that goes down in flames when Pearl Harbor is struck. At Guadalcanal, Kelly Turner is the amphibious force chief. On the night the Battle of Savo Island is waged, 4 Allied cruisers sunk, 1,000 sailors meet their end, and yet somehow Kelly Turner is able to kind of maneuver around the blame game and keep going forward. How does this come to pass? Well, part of the reason will be unknown to us historians because we weren't in the rooms where the private conversations were held among King and Nimitz and their brain trust. But I think what I have discovered is that Raymond Spruance settled early on Kelly Turner as the man he was going to put in charge of his tractor navy when the great Central Pacific offensive got going. Back in the 30s, Spruance and Turner struck up quite a friendship at the Naval War College. On exercises, they both came to appreciate the power of amphibious vehicles such as the Amtrak, which is under development by the Marine Corps in conjunction with the Navy. And it was Spruance who decided really at that time that Kelly Turner and Howling Mad Smith, the Marine general, Marine colonel at the time, were going to be his guys to handle the transformation of naval power into the business of heavy lift and heavy power, the projection of multiple Marine divisions over thousands of miles of ocean. So in my construct, Spruance at the top, Kelly Turner, the master of a critical specialty in the Pacific War, the seizure of heavily fortified enemy-defended islands. And so Turner, again, a specialist among specialists. We see the application and the fusion that takes place in the Marianas will be really a fusion of a team of highly technical, highly proficient specialists in particular disciplines of naval sea control and power projection. And Turner is an important cog in this construct. Now finally, the gentleman at right, Paul Tibbets. His backstory is somewhat interesting. He's not a naval officer. He belongs to the United States Army, U.S. Army Air Forces. In fact, Tibbets, who's famous now, of course, before he became famous, he was stationed in North Africa and in England as a B-17 squadron commander. He was very highly regarded in this capacity. He was participating in the very first B-17 strikes on the Low Countries up around Belgium and so forth as the war began. Transferred to North Africa under Jimmy Doolittle in the 15th Air Force. He was in on the North African campaign, and it was in that campaign that he ran afoul in a briefing of a very influential man who was serving as his group operations officer. The operations officer said, "We're going to strike the North African seaport of Bizerte at low altitude, 6,000 feet. And Tibbets took one look at him and said, "The hell we are, sir." He said, "We're all going to get blown out of the sky at 6,000 feet. This is not the kind of message you deliver to Colonel Loris Norstad." Loris Norstad will become one of the most important Air Force generals of the entire Cold War. He was politically connected, he was brilliant, he was willful, and he wasn't about to be insulted by a squadron commander in the middle of a briefing. So the next day, Colonel Tibbets is called in to see, I think it was Major Tibbets at the time, Major Tibbets is called in to see General Doolittle. And the famous general says to him, "Your operations officer wants to put in a court-martial for you, and I can't stop him. But what I can do is get you the hell out of this combat theater." He says, "General Arnold has an interesting new airplane, this multi-engine, long-range strategic bomber. It's got some wrinkles, some little clinkers. His engines tend to catch on fire, things like that. But we'll get it sorted out. By the way, we're deploying them now. We'll figure out the engine fire thing later. What do you think?" And so Tibbets had the offer he couldn't refuse. He heads home, goes home to Florida, kisses mom on the cheek, proceeds to Washington. And before you know it, Tibbets is earmarked for a very special project to command the secret units that will deliver the atomic bombs to Japan. So Tibbets is the hammer that the Navy will drop on Tokyo. It's Navy fuel that gets them there. It's naval power that takes the islands where they build the airfields. And so it's this fusion, again, this fusion of specialists, sea power and power projection that unfolds from the Marianas. Now, the fleet at flood tide, the title of my book, and from the jacket design with its dramatic picture of CV-16 USS Lexington launching a Hellcat, is going to evoke the big silhouettes at top left, the aircraft carriers of Task Force 58, which of course is very much part of the flood tide that will overwhelm Japan. 1943 is a year of building and waiting, but by the end of 43 we have the Essex-class boats coming off the line, and by early 44 we have them in concentration. This will enable any number of great things to be done under management of leaders like Admiral Spruance, Halsey, and Admiral Mitcher. But the real fleet at flood tide, I submit, is not so much the fast carriers, or even the battleships, or even the heavy cruisers and their powerful surface escorts. It's these little things down here at lower right, the landing craft. Now what we have here is annual U.S. naval production by type, 15 fast carriers in 1943, very impressive. But take a look at these four and five figure numbers down here. In the year 1944, I think it's 37,000 new amphibious craft joined the fleet. Now this is craft of all sizes, from landing ship docks to LVTs to LCVPs, the Higgins boats. But these are the ships that will make what Admiral King will call the outstanding development of the war operationally useful and possible. King is referring to heavy power, amphibious lift, and supply. This is the engine that pushes us across the Pacific. Admiral Nimitz pointed out that the Pacific is a vast place, but it's not a lonely ocean like the Atlantic. He called it a constellation. He described the Pacific as being large enough to encompass the entire landmass of the world, but it is itself a constellation of islands. It's those small vessels, crewed by coxswains and Coast Guard and any number of team members of our fighting forces, that'll carry Marine divisions and Army divisions across the Pacific And their reckoning begins at Majuro in May of 1944. The U.S. Fifth Fleet stages there for the landings in the Marianas. I love this photo because it really conveys the sense of the largest fleet units within a short swim of the beach. How often do we see this today in our area of high security and terrorists, bomb-loaded rafts, and so forth? Here we see the fleet and her sailors in very close quarters. So Saipan kicks off on June 15th. I should say, prior to this invasion, a major operation that serves as the prologue for my narrative is the strike on Truk, Operation Hailstone, February of 1944. This is where the carrier Navy proves that it's no longer just a hit-and-run outfit. Task Force 58's got 15 fast carriers at this time. 9 of them head south from Majuro and take on Truk Atoll. Let's go back to our map. You can see the strategic location, why Truk has to be neutralized. Right down here in the Western Caroline Islands, it's the 4th Fleet Area Headquarters. It's the Central Pacific Communications and Supply and Aviation Hub for the entire South Pacific campaign in 1942-1943. Forward base at Rabaul, but the brains are back at Truk, where Yamato sits for the duration. She never gets into the fight in the South Pacific. Why? Well, for want of fuel. So Japan's overextended. The dotted line I talked about earlier reflects the extent of their inner sphere, but at its peak, the Japanese were, they met their Waterloo at Midway, but the dotted line came out all the way to Guadalcanal at its peak, and we've driven them back to their inner sphere. You can see where Truk is situated. Truk stands astride the lines of communication that will take us from Majuro to Saipan. Much in the way that Guadalcanal needed to be invaded and taken once the Japanese put an air base there, land-based air power at Truk imperils the entire Central Pacific advance, so we are not going to be going into the Marianas until Truk is neutralized. So we have an incredible action set piece that kicks off our narrative as 9 carriers from Task Force 58 spend 2 full days off Truk, operating with virtual impunity, in part because the Japanese Navy is no longer there. The Japanese got a whiff of American patrol planes overhead at Truk and quickly realized that they needed to pull their major fleet units back to their bases in the Philippines and the Celebes. And so this they do just ahead of the major blow that Admiral Spruance drops on Truk in February of 1944. Pretty big naval air battle takes place there. The Japanese have several hundred Zeke fighters still at Truk. But this is very much a walkover. The theory had always been aircraft carrier power could never survive first contact with land-based air. Carriers had to hit and run. But Truk was a demonstration of the new state of the art. Carriers, because of their mobility, are awfully hard to find. Land-based air, you know where they are. You can maneuver around in the dark and strike at first light of morning and then pull back out of range. The mobility of United States aircraft carrier power really comes into its own as the Marianas campaign is kicking off. The strike on Truk is just an incredible epic, and I commend that subject to you for a little bit of further reading. But the landings at Saipan are preceded by several days of airstrikes by Task Force 58. We've got the old battleships of the bombardment group moving in the following morning. The fast battleships first with their flat trajectory fire that basically rings off the hilltops and doesn't do a whole lot of damage. Then the big old battleships with their differently calibrated parabolas standing at longer range, throwing high, almost like mortar trajectories on the garrison at Saipan. Within the 48 hours of this aerial and surface bombardment, the Japanese garrison in Saipan becomes uncommandable. The hard wires that are laid all across the island, across those ridges and mountains, are shattered and broken, and the 30,000-man garrison, commanded by Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, this was his disgrace after Midway, was to be made a garrison commander. Admiral Nagumo is in command of the naval and army forces defending Saipan. 30,000 men, but after 48 hours against Task Force 51's bombardment unit and Task Force 58's airstrikes, that garrison is essentially a company-level defense. It's every company on its own. Every company, squad, and platoon of the Japanese Army and Naval Special Landing Forces really have to function on their own. You've got to pity them. I saw the reports about the terror that's inflicted. We got a taste of it ourselves at Guadalcanal when Congo and Haruna came down and plastered the 1st Marine Division for a night. And we inflict this on them for 2.5 days. To be followed now by landings by the 2nd and 4th Marine Division at dawn on June 15th, preceded by UDT operations to blow holes in the reef, to locate the navigable channels ashore. The Amtrak-led invasion force pushes ashore under the leadership of Holland M. Smith and the leaders of the 2nd and 4th Marine Division on the morning of June 15th. Why is the Saipan campaign so important? It's important because for the first time in the Pacific War, we have an amphibious objective, an island, that really is a major landmass. It's more than 50 square miles. It's defended by 30,000 fanatical defenders. And it has Mount Tapachau at its center is a commanding peak about almost 1,600 feet high. So the Japanese have salted those mountains and those little coral crevices and caves of basaltic lava with mortars and medium artillery pieces that are very hard to dislodge. And so for the 2nd and 4th Marine Division, this becomes a very tough slog, along with the 27th Army Infantry Division, who comes in as the reserve. The most important thing about Saipan, aside from being a major landmass that requires multiple divisions to subdue, the Marshall's campaigns, all those islands were small atolls taken by regimental-size outfits. So we had the first major objective. The additional important feature of the Saipan campaign and of the other campaigns in the Marianas is that here, for the first time anywhere in the Pacific, we encounter a battlefield that has civilians on it as well. The Marianas are a fairly major commercial concern for the Japanese Empire. Sugar, copra, pineapples, the usual staples. And they've got about 25,000 ordinary people, merchants, administrators, nurses, clerks, supply people, inventory specialists, managing this mercantile economy. Well, that's no problem, right? Our tough Marines, they'll surrender in the face of our superior firepower, and they'll come into our stockades and accept the largesse of our medicine and our water and our food, and we'll get on with the business of driving the Japanese into the sea. These are the assumptions of Kelly Turner and Holland Smith and the Marine Division commanders. But Saipan will hold a revelation that shatters these expectations, and which, I will submit, ultimately has an impact on war strategy. The conduct of civilians in Saipan was the X factor going in, and this will be, again, my title slide, revelation and reverberation. The revelation of Saipan will stun American military commanders all the way back to the highest levels in Washington, thereby affecting our calculus for what we can expect in landings in the home islands. A little bit of a taste of the terrain of Saipan. Platoon level fighting. You can't always tell where your neighbor unit is. Your lines are broken. You're subject to infiltration, especially at night. The Japanese Army doctrine emphasized night fighting, infiltration, stealth, and all kinds of terrifying treachery, which we faced firsthand in concentrated form on a large landmass for the first time on Saipan. We also saw a taste of city fighting, a brief sharp fight for Garapan, shattered by naval bombardment. You can see the tin roofs broken and scattered, the buildings aflame, Marine artillery, Marine and Army artillery, as well as aerial and naval bombardment, worked over the coastal administrative capital of Saipan for those 48 hours and just reduced it to nothing. But the Japanese hold on, and the 2nd Marine Division holding the pivot as the 4th Marine Division goes ashore and thrusts all the way across the island. The 2nd Marine Division holds the pivot, and the gate swings up into a northward advance on Saipan. We see terrible fighting, not only in the central hills, but also in the cities along the coast road. And this is really terrible stuff. The Japanese know, again, going back to the map, I showed you the two parallel advances of the Southwest Pacific and the Central Pacific campaign. The only thing worse than the divided command structure that we accepted in undertaking this parallel Pacific westward advance, the only thing worse than trying to manage and deal with the complexities and problems that came out of that have to be the problems of confronting it in the defense. If you're the Japanese, where do you allocate your land-based aircraft marshaled in the Philippines, faced with the possibility of a Navy Marine advance into the Marianas and an Army advance across New Guinea and then towards, say, Biak and the Philippines? The Japanese never knew which direction we were going to be prioritizing with our offensive. And so they really marshal their strength up until they're certain that the Marianas are indeed the principal objective. They're prepared to deflect a thrust to either the Southwest Pacific or the Central Pacific, and it's not until the UDT are casing the reef lines into Saipan that the Japanese activate their plan for the defense of the Marianas. All through the Pacific War, you can see the Japanese looking for their moment, looking for their decisive battle. They think they have it. Well, they think they're going to have it in the Marianas when our carriers appear in strength. And so they marshal the entirety of the combined fleet and the combined fleet striking force, including all 9 of their aircraft carriers, to proceed out and to engage. The Marianas Turkey Shoot that follows is the largest aircraft carrier battle of the war. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, the nickname it acquires is the Turkey Shoot for the sheer number of air-to-air kills our pilots claim. Task Force 58 will claim more than 380 Japanese planes shot down. And it truly is an epic story. Battle of Midway involved on both sides 7 flat tops. Here we've got 24. And the fracas is entirely one-sided. Now, Spruance will wage this battle. Well, let me ask you, how would you wage, if you've got 15 aircraft carriers organized in 4 groups, commanded by Admiral Mitcher and his aggressive task group commanders, the likes of Jocko Clark, people like that, how are you going to conduct yourself? How are you going to use your carriers? The ethos of the aircraft carrier Navy has been mobility and offense. So if you're Mark Mitcher, you'll be chafing to push west, to launch air searches, to find that every carrier battle of the war has proceeded. The victor wins the battle on reconnaissance. You find the enemy first, you fix them, and you finish them. So therefore, what do we do if you're Mark Mitcher? Well, we surge west. We run our F-6Fs with drop tanks out to 450 miles in all directions. We find the enemy first, and we kill him. We're not going to be confined by geography. Terrible infighting took place within the Navy precincts during the Marshall Islands campaign. The USS Independence struck by a submarine, Liscombe Bay, another one, and terrible arguments precipitated, targeting really Admiral Spruance and his underlings for how they so-called tethered the aircraft carrier force to those islands in defense of the beachhead. Well, we come to the Marianas, and Raymond Spruance decides he's going to do it that way again. His mission is strategic in nature. Spruance understands the plans, he understands their role in the Joint Chiefs of Staff directives, and he understands that the reason for the Fifth Fleet's presence in the Central Pacific in the summer of '44 is not to go break and kill the Japanese Navy, is to seize these islands because of their strategic centrality astride the Japanese sea lanes of communication from Tokyo to the south. And also the small matter of what the Army Air Forces will be able to do with those islands once we possess them. Spruance's eyes were always on this prize. Spruance informs Admiral Mitcher, he says, you will not, repeat, will not, take your carriers to the west in search of fleet action. Yes, we believe the Japanese are coming. Yes, we also know the Japanese have a doctrinal, operational preference for diversion, for surprise, again, is very much the business of the aircraft carrier Navy. But we've seen this in combat. We've also seen it in the documents captured in the Philippines, Japanese Navy documents, specifically providing for decoy forces to draw our forces away and for them to slip in the rear. Spruance resolves he will not be taken out of position in his critical task, in his fundamental task of supporting Kelly Turner's amphibious force as they stand off Saipan and support the invasion. He decides he's going to have to fight a major carrier action, but he's going to have to win it in defense. And fortunately for the United States of America, our technologists have given us the tools to do just this thing. Not only have they produced a world-beating new naval fighter aircraft, the F-6F Hellcat, but we've devised such things as air search radar, fire control radar, and variable timed fuses, which was a nifty code for proximity fuses, which are in fact radar-controlled warheads fired by our battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. With weapons like that, you can eviscerate an attacking enemy force of aircraft while defending. And so Spruance realizes we can do this. We've got 15 carriers. We're going to concentrate them west of Guam. We're going to stand by and cover and support Kelly Turner's landings, and we're going to crush the Japanese force in defense. And that's exactly what Task Force 58 proceeds to do on the morning and afternoon of 19 June 1944. The so-called Battle of the Philippine Sea, known more famously as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, proceeds as Spruance holds the reins of his carrier commanders, holds them close to Guam, Saipan, and Tinian, and smashes Admiral Ozawa and his 9-carrier force as they close on the wind gauge, advancing into the wind. The Japanese can constantly steam east toward their enemy while launching and recovering planes because they're going into the trade winds. The American forces are constantly faced with having to turn and essentially retreat from the enemy in order to launch and recover planes. Yet another reason, Admiral Spruance concludes, for why we can't chase the Japanese and conduct a competently waged naval air battle. Again, a commander who appreciates not only the importance of planning, but more importantly, the importance of strategic geography in terms of limiting your choices and governing your objectives. This was something Spruance kept always foremost in mind. So here we have the track charts of the Americans and the Japanese. We have submarine sightings of the approaching Japanese force. The enterprising USS Kavala keeps a close eye on the combined fleet as it approaches the sea area west of the Marianas. She tries to send a report, is forced a number of times to submerge, pursue, resurface. And as the Japanese carriers finally cease advancing toward the Marianas and kind of operate in this area, Kavala races back and actually manages to engage the Japanese combined fleet and fires a spread of torpedoes, which smashes into IJN Shokaku, the fleet carrier. Shortly thereafter, another submarine, the Albacore, gets a hold of Taiho, and these two submarine attacks. Again, we have a cordon of submarines set up west of the Marianas to detect the approach of enemy fleet units, to do any number of things, but to reconnoiter, basically, to reconnoiter, make contact, and report. Submarines play a critical part in the Battle of the Philippine Sea for what they inflict upon the Japanese right at the moment they're launching the first of 5 waves of airstrikes against the Marianas. Ozawa has a trick up his sleeve. He's got airfields on Guam, as yet uninvaded, still in Japanese hands. He decides to shuttle bomb Task Force 58. What that means is you don't have to launch your planes on a round trip, thereby halving their range. You can launch them on a one-way trip out to the full extent of their range, land on Guam, rearm, refuel, maybe attack again, maybe go home, whatever. Ozawa has this advantage, and Spruance knows it. Again, all reinforcing the conclusion that Spruance has reached. He's going to win this battle on the defensive. The fighter squadrons of Task Force 58 are up to the job. The 5, just in very brief summary, the 5 waves of Japanese strikes are detected on radar. They're vectored by fighter control officers installed in the task group flagships. Very effectively, we fix the altitude and bearing of the enemy air groups as they approach. And it's a simple matter, simple now it seems, to vector swarms of F-6Fs to their targets. This is critical work because typically the F-6Fs would have to scout and locate their enemy targets, burning fuel all along the way, fuel that they cannot thereafter spend in combat. But through fighter direction, our F-6Fs are lethal in defense. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, 380 air-to-air kills. Now the great chapter in naval aviation's history follows the Turkey Shoot. This is the so-called flight beyond darkness. All the while the battle's being fought, all the while the Japanese planes are attacking Task Force 58, our search planes are venturing to the west, PBMs from the Garapan anchorage going out on these night missions over 600 miles, conducting radar searches of the seaways west of the Marianas. Task Force 58 is also sending out its Hellcats out to 450 miles with drop tanks. They're pretty darn good searchers themselves. The first sighting of Ozawa reaches Admiral Spruance late in the afternoon of June 19th. He confers with Admiral Mitcher. They've been instructed by Admiral Nimitz to be governed by the principle of calculated risk all along. You choose your moment when to strike. You choose your moment when to strike when your calculus is, in good faith, that you will inflict greater damage to the enemy than you'll take in turn. This is kind of the governing directive from Admiral Nimitz. It doesn't tell his commanders what to do, but it gives them a rubric. And one great thing that Admiral Nimitz always did was he gave his spot commanders discretion. But this is his rubric, his overall rubric. He leaves it to Spruance and Mitchell to determine what to do, and they quickly decide that the opportunity to sink the Japanese combined fleet aircraft carrier force is worth the risk of several air groups. Why is it a risk to the air groups? Well, our guys aren't night trained. We don't launch and recover carrier aircraft after dark. And so if we're going to spot a target at 3:30 in the afternoon and launch a maximum range strike to hit it, what it means is that we're going to be taking back aboard those U.S. pilots on our carriers well after dark. Mitchell and Spruance decide it's worth it. They confer with their air group commanders, and they launch an immediate strike on Ozawa's carriers. In the battle that follows, we have one Japanese aircraft carrier sunk, the Hayo, concentrated upon by aircraft from the Belleau Wood. As a handful of pilots, 2 or 3 pilots, strike the fatal blows that send Hayo to the bottom. Zuikaku is damaged. There's a picture of Zuikaku, the last surviving perpetrator of the Pearl Harbor attack, is targeted, is damaged, but makes it home on her own steam, utterly shorn of her air group. After the Battle of the Philippine Sea, although the Japanese will have flat tops, never again will they have pilots capable of operating effectively from those flat tops. So we have a very strategically important campaign in the sense that it sets up the Leyte Gulf campaign. It sets up any number of things, in fact. We have Admiral Halsey wondering, gee, I wonder if it was wise that Admiral Spruance stayed by the landing beachhead and didn't allow his carrier commanders to venture to the west. If I have my shot, well, I missed Midway. Spruance had that one too. I'm going to be aggressive. I'm going to chase the Japanese carriers. And of course, at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, what does Admiral Halsey do? He chases Japanese carriers, which are in fact decoys, and it really gives me the opportunity to write my first book. Again, prefiguring everything that will come later, we have the choices and the decisions of our naval commanders reverberating through the months and years as they second guess each other and wonder if they couldn't do better. Back on Saipan, meanwhile, we have important revelations afoot. Our Marine squad and platoon commanders are coming into contact with Japanese civilians. Now, how do they know this? Well, typically, as they clear the caves where the Japanese army takes refuge against the overpowering American advance under overpowering air support and naval bombardment, they're finding groups of bodies, dead Japanese in caves, blown apart in patterns that suggest that they're committing ritual suicide. The Japanese will not be, Japanese army, the culture is surrender is death. It's give the greatest honor is to die for your emperor, but you will not lay down your arms and accept captivity by your enemy. Moreover, the army is brainwashing essentially the Japanese civilians on Saipan that if you surrender to the Americans, they will do unspeakable things to you. Let me tell you, son of Nippon, about the specimen of humanity known as the United States Marine. To have your enlistment accepted in the United States Marine Corps, the Japanese tell their civilians, you have to prove your battle worthiness by killing your mother. And so if you fall into captivity by such barbarians, they will, if you're lucky, they will slit your throat. More likely, they will rape you and do all kinds of unspeakable things. Do not allow yourselves to be captive. This is the message systematically sent out to the civilian population of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam as the Marines close the lines and drive north on Saipan. And so what we're learning about Japanese civilians is that they are very much captive to the death-seeking, cult-like mentality of the Japanese army. It's nothing like we thought would happen. Here we have a United States Marine giving some care to a young Japanese child. This is reality, but the myth is what prevails in the caves of central Saipan. And so what happens is, as the Japanese extinguish themselves in their typical form, the Japanese army with Banzai charges, it was quite a spectacular when the final Banzai charge in Saipan takes place just a few days ahead of August 9th, 1944, when the island is declared secure. The final Banzai charge takes place along the western coast of Saipan from the little village of Makunsha. The surviving Japanese garrison marshals an estimated 1,800 men. Some of the estimates went as high as 4,000. Looks like it was really about 1,800. the last of the Japanese infantry in Saipan, along with their wounded, really the Bamboo Lancers Brigade. Some of these guys didn't have weapons. They're carrying sticks. They're on crutches. They come flying down the coast, and they managed to overrun elements of the 27th Army Infantry Division. But we're accustomed to seeing that. We're accustomed to seeing the suicidal impulse of the Japanese Army play itself out in major campaigns. What we don't expect is what the civilians do. And so I believe it's around July 20th. We have a battlefield tour. We have a visit to Saipan by the top Navy brass. Here in the Jeep, leaning forward in the passenger seat, we have Admiral King, Chief of Naval Operations and the Commander of the United States Fleet. We have Nimitz behind him, and we have standing is Holland Smith, the Corps Commander. General Smith has a pick squad of Marine riflemen in the other Jeep, and they undertake a circumnavigation of Saipan's coastal roads. And they witness what happens on the northern coast of Saipan, so-called Marpi Point, it's called. Its geographic feature involves these 200-foot cliffs straight down into basaltic lava and the surf, and the spectacle that greets the Marine riflemen in the forward lines of the 2nd and 4th Marine Division is one of unspeakable, ghastly shock and tragedy as Japanese women and children leap to their deaths off these cliffs. Nobody can believe what they're seeing. Japanese language specialists are brought forward, hastened forward, called on the bullhorns, get the hell up here, talk to these people. And they're trying to talk the people back from the cliffs, and one by one they jump. They wade out into the surf and extinguish their lives. They drown themselves rather than accept captivity by the barbaric Americans. So King and Nimitz and Holland Smith see this up front. And the impression that registers on our top naval commanders in the Pacific goes all the way home to the top precincts of decision-making in Washington and at the combined chiefs of staff level. King returns to San Francisco and then to Quebec, where at the Hotel Frontenac for the combined chiefs of staff, the second Quebec conference takes place there with the British leadership. And the impressions of Saipan register here. Nimitz returns to Pearl Harbor, where he meets with President Roosevelt at the end of July. The key strategic planning session between General MacArthur and Nimitz takes place in Honolulu. And President Roosevelt gets a firsthand report of the tragedy and the revelation of Saipan. I found this in General MacArthur's memoirs. It's a letter that he received from President Roosevelt August 9th, 1944, following their meeting in Honolulu. You've been doing a really magnificent job against what were great difficulties given us by climate and by certain human animals. The language in red is just sort of a tossed-off line in a personal letter. But it wasn't printed red in the letter, but I made it red because it really read as red when I saw it. My God, this rhetoric coming from a Democratic president, an idealist who thought that there were ways to expunge the scourge of warfare from the human condition, is now confronted by the reality of civilian suicide at Saipan with the prospect of even worse to come in the Japanese home islands. And he's reached certain conclusions about his enemy. Here we have a private expression of it in a letter to MacArthur. A few weeks later, we have an Allied press communique from Quebec City reporting on the conference of the combined chiefs of staff, which is just adjourned. In a very short space of time, they reached decisions on all points, both with regard to the completion of the war in Europe, now approaching its final stages, and the destruction of the barbarians of the Pacific. Again, the language in red is kind of jarring, especially in this context of an official Allied press communique summarizing the findings of strategic leadership with respect to very large issues of the pursuit of the war. The barbarians of the Pacific. I submit that these were signals which ultimately reached our area commanders, our field commanders. And this is a press communique. Any Marine rifleman in the Pacific could have picked this up. And I expect also that these messages had a certain audience within the Army Air Forces. These islands are quickly turned to their use: Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. I'm skating right past very fascinating operations during the seizure of Tinian. Admiral Spruance called it the most successful amphibious operation of the war for the manner in which a diversionary landing froze the Japanese garrison in place. Landings in the north of the island, ringing the island in steel, American battleships and cruisers, forcing the Japanese to pivot and displace to confront the invasion, and thereby come under eviscerating neutralization and destructive fire from the naval bombardment forces. We're skipping right past that. We have 3 island campaigns in succession. Saipan, the first taste of Japanese civilian suicidal impulse, repeated on Tinian, repeated on Guam. Those 3 campaigns, all leading to the same result. All 3 islands becoming the most valuable piece of strategic aviation real estate in the world. Before the islands were even secure, the Army aviation engineers and Seabees, as you see portrayed here, are transforming these 3 islands into a hive for the B-29 bomb wings of General Hap Arnold's Army Air Force. I should have mentioned at the outset, the Army Air Force support was the reason Nimitz was even able to clear and get approved the plan to go into the Marianas. Again, there was this deadlock at the Joint Chiefs of Staff level, but when Hap Arnold says, "I want those islands," the Navy was given the mission of taking them for Army air power to use. And so the transformation is begun very rapidly, and the first strikes from Saipan by the 73rd Bomb Wing and affiliated units are launched from Saipan on Thanksgiving Day 1944. General Haywood Hansell, the commander of 21st Bomber Command, a subunit of the 20th Air Force, is in command of the original scheme here, and his scheme is high-altitude precision bombardment. This is what he had seen work to such great effect over Germany, and it's how he thinks he'll bring Imperial Japan to heel. It's not quite so simple over Japan and its famous typhoon winds, especially at high altitude at 30,000 feet. Maybe some of the gentlemen from the 20th Air Force can tell us what it's like to ride a 100-mile-an-hour tailwind in a 4-engine bomber. It certainly tends to scatter your bomb load. And so the first strikes on Japan staged from the Marianas were an abject failure, and General Hansell is replaced by Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay comes in chomping his cigar, and he meets with his wing commanders, and he says, "We're going to do things differently," he says. "We're going to fly our bombers at 6,000 feet, just what Major Tibbets refused to do." LeMay says, "We're going to fly at 6,000 feet, and we're going to drop incendiaries. We're going to get rid of these dumb 500-pound high explosives, and we're going to burn Japan." And that cigar-chomping son of a bitch, it's just what he does. One city after another, 50%, 66%, 75% of the urban areas of Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, all of them, tremendous civilian casualties. We have a moral threshold that's being crossed here. We have conscious, deliberate targeting of civilian populations by high-altitude bombing. Some people might call them terror weapons. It just is what it is. It was the way of warfare in 1944-45. This is what total war was. Total war means your entire country is at war. Not only your service branches, but your industry. Not only your industry, but your civilian populations. In World War II, every nation in the world subscribed to this belief that it was legitimate to target civilian populations. And so we're just raising it to the next level. We're doing it efficiently, effectively, and ultimately in the cause of ending this god-awful moral atrocity that is the Asia-Pacific War. Every day that it went on, ordinary, innocent civilians died in mainland Asia, in China, in Burma, in Thailand, in Malaya, on Okinawa. Not to mention the combat forces clashing. We're talking about Imperial Japan's predations in Manchuria and China and so forth. The motive expressed at every level. We're waging this type of warfare. It's tremendously ugly. It involves moral questions that should be talked about, but the motive is within the realm of what philosophers will later call just ad bellum, so the morality of going to war and the morality of what you do in the war. As long as you have a chance of victory and your motives are to end the fighting. You know, there's a rubric that philosophers have arranged, and a lot of it is verbal circularity, honestly. But every expression of motive I've ever seen from an American commander was to end the war as rapidly as possible. And this is at the level of President Roosevelt and Truman, General Marshall, Admiral King, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. So this is what we'll comfort ourselves with, is that we are faced with extremists, such as General Koroshika Anami, the Chief of Staff of the Imperial Japanese Army, who serves as well on the Supreme Policymaking Council of Emperor Hirohito, his so-called War Direction Council, known colloquially as the Big Six. These are 6 high commanders, naval, army, as well as the prime minister, who advise Emperor Hirohito. Their decisions are binding. Emperor Hirohito's authority has no legal force under the Japanese constitution. He's a semi-divine presence, a figurehead with no policy-making authority. So the decisions of the Big Six are what will govern Japan's decisions in war, including the decision to surrender or not to surrender. Three of the members of the so-called Big Six believe that the penalty for defeat by Imperial Japan should be the death of every man, woman, and child in Nippon. They believe that, well, the decisive battle was not won in the Marianas. We lost our fleet. Okinawa is going badly. Maybe that won't be our decisive battle either. General Anami, when questioned by his emperor in the Big Six, advocates, the Emperor Hirohito asks him why Okinawa is not going so well. This will not be our decisive battle, will it? And he says, well, we believe our decisive battle will be in the home islands themselves. They will require us to invade them and subdue them through the projection of Kelly Turner's brand of heavy lift and amphibious power, perfected in the Marianas and at Iwo Jima and at Okinawa, and then finally projected against Japan itself. The Japanese will require this of us because although enough Japanese authorities believe Japan has been beaten as early as July of 1944, the political consensus is we must fight on for reasons of our own dignity. This is groupthink at its worst. Groupthink was a construct of Graham Allison talking about the Vietnam War and McNamara and all that, but Japan's very much in the grip of it in the critical summer of 1945. We have a battle of persuasion going on. It's often said that amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics. And I agree with that. Professionals do talk logistics. I believe professionals also talk something else, especially at the highest level. They talk psychology. Short of complete annihilation, no force is beaten until its commander reaches the conclusion in his mind that he has been beaten and concedes to lay down his arms. No national leader surrenders on behalf of his country until he himself is convinced that the war cannot be profitably fought any further. So it's a state of mind that we have to compel our enemy to arrive at to defeat somebody in war. It's a psychological battle. I was fascinated to find the thinking and the logic that underlay the formulation of propaganda leaflets such as this, which were dropped over Japanese island garrisons and over the home islands by the tens and twenties of thousands in the summer of 1945, advocating to the Japanese populace that to pursue this war any longer was to march into death and hopelessness, into this nether realm from which there was no escape. We had to be very careful. A lot of these explanatory Navy studies would talk about how, well, first of all, you have to pitch these things. You have to use kanji, which will appeal to ordinary frontline troops in some cases. You can't use, flowery, advanced language. You have to speak to them where they live. And where the Japanese armed forces live is in a place that requires them to maintain their dignity at all costs. So what the act of persuading Emperor Hirohito to announce the surrender of Japan will have to, in some manner, give him the cover for Japanese national pride that he needs in order to bring his population along and end the war. We see this in microcosm on Saipan. I developed the story of the Japanese side of the Saipan fight from the point of view of a Japanese nurse on that island and also a Japanese infantry commander. This infantry commander, Captain Sakai Oba, his unit was torpedoed in its transports coming ashore in May of 1944 by American submarines. And so they swim ashore, and he forms up this bedraggled force and takes to the hills when the Americans come ashore. And he declines to join the final suicide rush from Makunsha along the west coast of Saipan. He realized, what profit, what honor am I bringing my emperor if I extinguish my life foolishly? I'm going to fight on. And so he will not throw down his arms without a fight, and he won't throw it down in a foolish act that defies the intelligence of a military man, such as a Japanese army captain, such as he was. So the story of Japanese pride weaves itself through my stories in a couple of levels, but really at the highest level, we have to convince Emperor Hirohito that he's got to surrender. So we're facing the prospect of landing in the Japanese home islands. Operation Olympic will be landings in Kyushu, set for November of 1945, to be followed by landings in the Tokyo Plain in March of 1946. Operation Downfall is the overarching operation to invade and conquer the principal home islands of Japan. Now, something very terrible happens for this whole project in May of 1945. Germany surrenders. Well, how could that be? The story, as we've all learned it, is, well, after Germany surrendered, we're going to transfer all the fighting power of General Eisenhower's armies on the continent, transfer them home and put them on transports and send them out to Hawaii and Guam and Ulithi and the Philippines and stage these grizzled veterans for the final conquest of Japan. Not only that, we're going to bring the whole 8th Air Force under command of General Doolittle, and we're going to park them in Okinawa, this hard-won real estate seized through heavy losses in April, May, and June of 1945, and we're going to have this close supply base to sustain that effort. B-17s, B-20, the 8th Air Force will use B-29s, won't they? We'll have B-29s on Okinawa, and we're going to use carrier power and project it against the home islands as well. But that's not how the politics on the home front are going to let this go. The war economy has been a compromise. The Army has control of any number of goods and services, rations. There are restrictions on, say, nightclubs, bars, and restaurants. There are restrictions people have accepted in the cause of victory. But once Germany surrenders, the feeling is, we've got this thing won. Let's bring the boys home. The pressure to bring the boys home leads General Marshall to design a point system that governs who gets to come home based on who served where and for how long. And so the long and short of it is all these veteran European Army units who everybody thinks are going to be storming the beaches in Japan, they're actually gutting themselves by demobilization. Not only that, but the Army restrictions, which are constricting the economy, labor and captains of industry alike are advocating for a reconversion, is the term, reconversion of the economy from Army control and to allow private enterprise to resume doing what it does best, namely make things and make money. And so these domestic pressures are piling up on President Truman, on General Marshall as his really essential advisor and chief. General MacArthur is doing his thing. General MacArthur is advocating. Well, first of all, MacArthur arranges to assure his own appointment to be the Supreme Commander of Allied Powers, to conduct the landings, to be in charge of the landings overall, and later to become Supreme Commander of Allied Powers. MacArthur is hoarding shipping in the Philippines for his own needs. He's conquering the southern Philippine islands in a rather needless way, given that the momentum has to be gathered up and projected north toward Japan. All these forces are conspiring against the orderly execution of Operation Olympic, and really putting a tremendous amount of pressure on our planners to make sure we've got enough men to ensure the success of that operation. General MacArthur's intelligence headquarters is registering larger and larger numbers of Japanese divisions in the southern Japanese home island. The number of available Japanese aircraft is escalating from 4 to 6 to 10,000 aircraft, half of which, it turns out, will be allocated to kamikaze attack. It's looking very bad indeed. And so these domestic pressures are piling up on President Truman. And isn't it a good thing for all of us sitting here today that the project at Los Alamos worked? That the challenge of designing a compressive sphere of conventional explosives that will implode with such simultaneity as to ignite and push a plutonium core to go critical and produce a nuclear chain reaction, an atomic chain reaction. will be successful, and that Paul Tibbets has trained the 509th Composite Group to deliver these weapons in his own special way. He's been operating in this corner of Northfield and Tinian for months through the summer of '45, much to the chagrin of most of the 20th Air Force. They don't know what he's doing. All they know is he's running these training missions. He's not losing men over Japan. They sort of have this special status, and the sarcastic kind of the sarcastic jibes going around. Oh yeah, Tibbets and his men, they're going to win the war, you know. But Tibbets is working on this project. His operational tradecraft is to drop an atomic bomb and live to tell the tale. And basically that involves diving a B-29 like an SBD Dauntless in a 180-degree diving turn and opening up a 6.5-mile distance by the time that puppy goes off. This is his tradecraft. This is what he trains his men in. They practice in Cuba. They practice around the Pacific Islands, around Tinian. And finally, their project is to drop that bomb to make what really turns out to be what Tibbets would call a milk run over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and strike the first atomic blow with the little boy against Japan. The Japanese don't know what's hit them. The first indication that Hiroshima has been hit by something unprecedented is when it goes off, is when the national radio broadcasting system from Hiroshima, the transmitter, goes offline. There's a rumor that something has happened, and a officer from the general staff is sent in an aircraft to fly over to Hiroshima and take a look. And what he reports is, is rather unprecedented. It won't be until after the Nagasaki bomb is used that the deadlock I mentioned among the big six is broken. I feel like we need to get to our Q&A here, so I'm just going to push through to the final act. The second atomic bomb, with the destruction of Nagasaki, compels Emperor Hirohito to gather his war council and to take a more active role in their deliberations. His specific project is to break that deadlock. Through a very emotional oration in meetings over the course of August 12th, 13th, 14th, Emperor Hirohito arrogates to himself the project of saving humanity. He specifically cites the enemy's use of the 2 atomic bombs. He tells his big six that their repeated promises of the great decisive battle have not borne out, that given that the enemy is using this new and terrible weapon, it will be my responsibility to save the Japanese race and to save the people of the world by announcing surrender. And this he announces to his people in the Imperial, over the radio on August 15th, the Imperial Rescript, in which he announces Japan's intent to accept the Potsdam Declaration, which insists on unconditional surrender. There's been a parlay over terms. One of the problems is, and we know this because of the ultra-intercepts of Japanese military and the magic intercepts of Japanese diplomatic communications, is that the Americans are all too aware of the disagreement among the foreign minister, the envoy to Russia, who goes there ostensibly with the idea of seeking Russian involvement in brokering a peace. We're all too aware that the Japanese themselves have not agreed on terms that they will accept. They're insisting on all kinds of terms. The preservation of the imperial throne. They want no war crimes tribunals, no occupation, and all kinds of things like this, each of which is a deal breaker for President Truman. So it's not until after the second bomb that Emperor Hirohito finds himself compelled to go down and give this speech to his war council and break the deadlock. We had to give Japan room for their pride. We had to give Emperor Hirohito permission to surrender. I see books written that say the bomb played no specific role in his decision to surrender. There's no evidence that the bombs had any role in Hirohito's thinking. It was really the Soviet entry of the war on August, what was it, the 9th? The same day the Nagasaki bomb fell. But you go back and you read the rescript and you see the reference to the bomb. Whether it was a heartfelt conclusion or whether it was mere cover for his own pride, he cited the bomb as the reason Japan had to surrender. If all the bomb did was give Hirohito the cover, a little fig leaf for his pride, and to say, okay, now we can throw in the towel and capitulate, then the 509th Composite Group and the entire apparatus that put it there on Tinian did its job and served the goal of not only our country, but eventually of the United Nations, the entire worldwide democratic project of ending tyranny in the world as fast as humanly possible. Now that said, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here today and to invite our veterans, I guess, is that what we're going to do, have Q&A or bring them up now to give a talk. So thank you.
We have three veterans tonight, and we'll do this quite quickly here. Milford was born in Lisle, Minnesota. His father was a Lutheran minister. He had a brother who was in the Third Army, a combat engineer, a sister. He heard about Pearl Harbor on the radio and enlisted at 17 with his parents' permission. Went to basic training at Great Lakes, then did gunnery at Whidbey Island. He was then assigned to the USS New Jersey battleship, and because of his typing skills, had assignment in the commo section. How about that one for typing skills, huh? And this was in Bremerton. He was involved in the operations in Okinawa, and Milford, talk about the message you heard that you transmitted about the atomic bomb.
I worked in communications with the officers, and the officers would get the information, would come in on code, and then they'd make strips, and I would type it up, and then it would go to all the 7th Fleet and Halsey and everybody. But we got the information of the atom bomb, and at that time we thought the war was over.
Now, you were in Tokyo Bay when you saw this.
We were
about being in Tokyo Bay.
Well, when we went in Tokyo Bay, why, it was in the evening, and when we were all standing on deck waiting to see Japan, and when the sun came up, we saw Mount Fuji, and it was a beautiful sight. But then as the sun came up, we saw all the devastation. We were in Yokosuka, and that was a naval base, and all the buildings were shattered, and the trains were all down, and there was a destroyer and a cruiser lying on its side in the bay. And we were just amazed at the total destruction of everything around it.
You stayed in Tokyo for a while.
We stayed in Tokyo Bay for about 3 months. When we first got in there, the Missouri was there, the battleship, and the Iowa was there, and then the New Jersey was there. But the Missouri left right after the signing, and then about 30 days later, the Iowa left. And I'll never forget when the Iowa left, I was standing on deck, and this big, beautiful ship went alongside us, and they right alongside us, they piped the Hawaiian war chant. And I'll never forget that.
Can you give a description of your memory of that flyover from the deck of the New Jersey?
Okay, after the signing, why, we noticed in the south, the sky was just black. And the planes started coming over. We saw it about treetop height. But first, the B-29s came over, and I understood there were 265 of them. And then after the B-29s came over, the Navy came over. And the Marines came in the Corsairs, and then the Navy came in TBMs, the dive bombers, and then the SB-2C dive bomber came over, and after that, the F-6F Hellcats came over. But the planes kept coming over for about an hour. And I talked to a man in the Missouri, and he said 30 days later, his ears were still ringing.
You stayed on the island, and I think you had a little recreation. You want to tell about the geisha girls?
Well, we had R&R by divisions, and the communication division was very small. So we took a Jeep to Mount Fuji, where there's a hotel. And in the hotel, the geisha girls were there, and they would sing and dance and put on a program for us. And after the program, we went down to the hot tub. We took our clothes off, and there's a big hot tub. And before we knew it, the geisha girls were there, and they took off their towels, and they got in with us. It presents a picture that never leaves.
But in your travels around the island, you did talk about the devastation. You want to remark on that any further?
Well, the devastation was just unbelievable. All the houses were flattened, and I took a train into Tokyo, and from Yokosuka we went through Yokohama. Yokohama was really bad, and we got into Tokyo, and we went by the Imperial Palace, and we were just amazed. The Imperial Palace was never touched, but there was devastation all the way around it, but the bombers were just amazing. They could spare the Imperial Palace. But I got into the train station in Tokyo, and the griff was gone, but another train came in, and they were discharging Japanese soldiers from Korea and China. And these soldiers were the worst-looking men you'd ever seen. They were very small to begin with, and their uniforms were ragged and dirty. They looked just awful. They came home to nothing, and it was very pathetic.
After 3 months in Tokyo Bay, you sailed out and you went down to the Philippines. Tell us how you got home.
Well, after we left Tokyo Bay, we were on our way home to Long Beach, and we went through a tidal wave, and that is like the wind 75 miles an hour, and the waves are about 20 feet high, and the ship was, well, it was just kind of rocking. But we got a call from a destroyer, and the destroyer said they had a man that was chronically seasick. Could we pick him up? So they gave us their location, and we found them. We found the destroyer, and the destroyer was going just like this, and we were going like this. But they passed a line over, and pretty soon they pulled the cable back, and the guy came in a basket, and they pulled him up, and he didn't get wet at all. But he got on our ship, and we had a doctor, and about 3 days later, he was fine. But that's the way the Navy is. They protect their own.
But you also had some of the crewmen from the Indianapolis that you brought home.
Oh, yeah. The Indianapolis delivered the atom bomb from San Francisco to the island, Tinian. But anyway, when the Indianapolis was going back to U.S., the captain asked for an escort, and Halsey said, if you wait a day or two, we'll have one for you. But the captain was eager to get back to Hawaii. So they took off, and about 2 days later, at midnight, the Japanese submarine found them, and they put a torpedo into the armament and a torpedo into their oil supply, and the ship just exploded. And 12 minutes later, it was gone. 900 men were killed, 300 were set adrift. And the men that were set adrift were, the Navy didn't know about it, so they spent a week fighting the sharks and trying to keep alive. Finally, the Navy found them, and they rescued them, and they brought them back to a hospital ship. And when they got well, they apportioned them out to go back to U.S., and the New Jersey was apportioned 12. I'll never forget seeing those guys come aboard. They had dungarees, they were looking sort of bit, and they had just a DD bag, that's all they had. But I visited them because they were given their separate compartment, so I learned all about what happened to the Indianapolis. But I'll never forget, they played a record, and they played it continuously, Doris Day, Sentimental Journey. And that was just their theme song all the way home. But there's a memorial to them in Indianapolis that's worth seeing. It's near the downtown, but it's a beautiful memorial to those people.
Our next speaker is a guy that's been on a couple of programs before. He's one of my favorite people. I'll confess, I've developed love affairs with lots of these veterans, and you're one of them, Bob. Bob was born in Minneapolis, graduated from South High School. Graduated in 1943, went down to the Federal Building, summer of 43 after graduation, signed up, came out to Fort Snelling, enlisted, got on a train, went down to Jefferson Barracks for basic training, and he told me about this Drill Sergeant Ray, which we won't get into right now, but 70 some odd years later, still had an impression on him. He said that and his wife made him. How about that? Went down to Barksdale for classes. Again, the war was starting to wind down. September of 44, went to gunnery school at Fort Myers, Florida. Just went through the hurricane, did ground firing, and then went up in B-17s and shot at flying targets. After that, he knew he was going somewhere. He got a furlough, came home to Minneapolis for a few days, and then headed back to Kansas City to join a troop train that was headed for Alamogordo, New Mexico. That's where my son is now based. At Alamogordo, on the train going down, an officer came by and said, here's my list of people. Mickelson, you're on my list, so you're on my crew now. So the crew was actually formed on the train headed to Alamogordo. They did bombing, and I'm going to let Bob talk about some of that practice bombing at Alamogordo. From there, they came up to Wichita, got a brand new B-29, headed out for California, Hawaii, Kwajalein, and Guam, and landed on Guam as a part of the 20th Air Force. Bob, can you start from when you were at Alamogordo, the training missions that you did out of Alamogordo?
I just landed on Guam. I'm back in Alamogordo.
It's called flashback.
Well, let's see about Alamogordo. Can you hear me?
Put it on your chin.
Okay. We didn't have enough airplanes to fly every day, so we were flying about every third or fourth day in our training flights. We flew west over Arizona, Southern California, out over the Pacific, made a U-turn, came back and dropped bombs on a bombing range in Arizona. All the time we were there, we were flying 25, 26, 27,000 feet. It was a complete change when we got to the Pacific. There, it was 12,000 was about the highest we would fly, and many missions were at 5, 6, and 7,000. Does that answer your question?
And then let's get you to Guam then. And what happened when you got to Guam?
Well, there was some things, several things that happened, but I don't know what you're referring to.
Well, you started missions when you
Okay.
landed.
Well, we had a few training flights. One of them, by the way, was to Truk. And we bombed the runway at Truk, and the bombs extended out over the end of the runway into the water because the Truk was supplied by submarine, and their berthing was at the end of the runway. And the other island we bombed for practice was Rota, R-O-T-A, just a little bit north of Guam. Then you want me to continue?
Yeah.
I wanted to say something tonight.
Say it.
Okay. When Don Patton called me and said, will you say a few things? I said, what do you want to talk about? He said, VJ Day. And I said, I told him that I was on a destroyer in Tokyo Bay on VJ Day, a couple of miles, I think, from the Missouri. And I said, I will tell you tomorrow night how I got to that destroyer. Am I allowed to do that?
You absolutely.
He said, if you can do it in 7 minutes, go ahead. So we were on Guam, and we started our missions, Osaka, Yokohama, then on to a mission in Tokyo, a couple of daylight missions in southern Kyushu, because we were supporting the kamikaze raids on Okinawa. And in one of those, we broke the rules and did not do what we do drop on command. We dropped bombs on our own with our own bombardier, because we had a crew that was unusual. A former flight instructor as a pilot, a bombardier instructor, a radio instructor, a flight engineer instructor, and a gunnery instructor. I was low man on the totem pole there. I was corporal. But we all got along real good, and we were really proud of the work we did. We were reprimanded severely for dropping bombs on our own rather than on the command of the bombardier squadron bombardier. But we were the only ones that hit the target. Another thing happened there. They said, after your 10th mission, you're going back to the States for more training. And the only thing they would say was the training is because of your bombardier. Not that he broke any rules, but that he was probably the best bombardier in the world. We started our missions then, shortly after that. The first one was a night mission to Tokyo, and then a few of the other cities, and then some navigation flights where we navigated for the P-51s out of Iwo Jima, and we took them, navigated them to Japan. And as they did in Germany, they were shooting at anything that moved. And then we'd navigate back to Iwo Jima for them. And since I only have 7 minutes, I'm going to skip to the other part of it.
Go to that 9th or 10th mission.
The 24th of May was a bomb run to Tokyo, a night incendiary place. And we made that with some difficulty. Our bomb bay doors would not close. We had a lot of trouble and lost our ability to conserve gas, so we landed on Iwo Jima and got the bomb bay under control, got more gas, went back to Guam, and we landed about noon. And there was another full effort bomb run that night, again to Tokyo. Fujiyama, yes, that was our initial point on the second night. And immediately leaving Fujiyama, heading northeast to Tokyo, we were hit by ground fire, our number 2 engine burning up, a magnesium fire, and then we were hitting the tail. And so now we are in big doo-doo. I called the captain and I said, let's get the hell out of here. I did not want to burn up in the air. The bombardier called back and said, no, let's ride it down. We don't want to be captured. And the captain then, being the person that he was, said only 3 words: target straight ahead. And so we went another 20 minutes into Tokyo, dropped our bombs, and then had the signal to jump. three of the crew members did not make it that night. One of them was Jim McKenzie, and he was the radio operator that had come back to help us with some other things. And I turned to look at Jim, who was lying on the floor, bleeding. And one of the big one of the regrets of my life is that I never said goodbye to Jim. I turned and jumped. We were captured almost immediately on the ground, and taken the next morning. I'm skipping a lot of things here, by the way. Taken the next morning to a building that we're told was Kempitai, which is the secret police of Japan. The first interrogation was that day, the second interrogation that night, the third interrogation a day later. In that third, I'm skipping many things here, so you'll forgive me. The third interrogation was questions about the B-29. Mostly about how fast did it fly, where did you come from, how many bomb bays. The Japanese knew all the answers to all of these questions, but then the question became, have you ever seen a bomb bay that has been modified? And of course I had not. Have you ever seen a B-29 with one bomb bay? No. Have you seen a B-29 that would be capable of holding a very large bomb? No. And at that point, all hell broke loose, and I was feeling a lot of pressure, and some things that have stayed with me for many years. No, I finally told him a lie. I said, yes, I have. I've heard of a blockbuster bomb. It's a bomb that is so large, the airplane carries only one bomb, and when they drop it, everything in a 1,200-yard radius is destroyed. And that stopped the owies. And there were two more interrogations which were very mild. I'm skipping now several months ahead. The 15th of August, we were served, instead of the rice ball, we were served a soup. It was salt soup with a little seaweed in it, and we wondered what was going on. Something has changed. The next day, we were blindfolded, tied up, blindfolded, put in trucks, and carried to the shores of Tokyo Bay. Their machine guns had been set up, and you could move your head back, you could see out the bottom of the blindfold. And since we were not POWs, but we were war criminals, I thought, this is my last day alive. And I looked around and I thought the other people the other POWs were about as upset as I was as what was about to happen. And then there was a big argument behind us at the machine guns. The chief interrogator there with his aide, we called Junior, and a mystery person, and they were all three of them arguing. And finally they packed up the machine guns, put them in the truck, and drove away. At that point, we got back into the truck, and we were taken to a Mori POW camp, and this is the famous one of Unbroken. Somebody this evening mentioned the name Boynton, and I think we made it as a joke, did we? But Pappy Boynton was at Omori, and it'll take me just a moment to tell you about his existence there. He was well-dressed, clean-shaven, in good shape. When he walked around, I was told that when he walked around the area, the guards lowered their gaze. They would not stare him or look him directly in the eye. And I said, why was all that? They said, because he was a great warrior, and they respected him for that reason. There was something else that reminded me of it here.
You were going to tell the story that Stassen told you. One of our, when Harold Stassen told the story about your liberation.
Okay. How do I get to that point so easily? We were told to stay in a kind of like a low barracks building because we were not prisoners of war. We were war criminals, and so we stayed there for 3 or 4 days until we were told to come out and onto the parade grounds. The commandant of that camp was going to give a speech, and he did. And what he said, through an interpreter, was that the United States Army and the Japanese Army are now combining to fight the threat from Russia. We were now friends. And of course, we said nothing about that. We didn't want to get in trouble there. The next morning, the camp was unusually quiet, and the only Japanese in the camp was the interpreter. All the rest of the guards and everyone else were gone. We robbed the storehouses of everything they had, all the food, everything we could find. This was about the 18th or 19th of August. And we stayed there doing whatever we could to survive until the 29th of August, and we were looking out in Tokyo Bay. We could see all the ships there. And then a launch boat came, and in that launch boat there were some Marines with rifles and Tommy guns and a person dressed in white. It was Harold Stassen, former governor of the state of Minnesota. And he had come from Halsey's ship. And later on, when I talked to Governor Stassen, I asked him about this, what happened. And he said MacArthur had ordered that no American service person should set foot in Japan until the armistice, excuse the word, until the surrender is signed. And Stassen and Halsey talked it over, and Stassen said, it is possible that the POWs there will be murdered before we can prevent it. And Halsey replied, I cannot order you to do anything, but let's save our boys. And so they came in to Omori. Stassen got out of the launch, and the one interpreter, Japanese interpreter left, told Stassen, I have no authority to release these prisoners. Stassen looked at him and pointed, and he said, you have no authority, period. What happened to the interpreter after that, I don't know. We never saw him again. I have in this envelope some pictures of Stassen, if anybody wants to see him after.
But you were then liberated to the destroyer?
That afternoon, late that afternoon out, we came. They took prisoners off out of Omori and parceled them out to different boats in the bay. And so
you saw that same flyover that day at the surrender?
Yes.
Okay, if you'd pass it down to Harold. Harold Gifford is an unbelievable story. Born in Comfrey, Minnesota on a farm. How many times have we heard that story from that greatest generation? Born on a farm. At age 9, his family moved into town. At age 11, moved into Mankato. He earned money by selling the Mankato newspaper on the street. He quit high school in 1940 and had a brother, and we're going to talk about the brother at some length here. The brother was on the USS Oklahoma in Pearl Harbor. Came back, and Harold promised he would finish his schooling. But those of us that have such a great life, thanks to these guys, don't know the hardship of the Depression. He ended up not finishing high school, got a job on a dairy farm, entered the military December of '42, and from the Twin Cities went down to Jefferson Barracks. That's where somebody else did their basic training. Then wanted to be a flight. Everybody wanted to fly, right? Went down to Kansas State, did his flight training, went down to San Antonio in the aviation cadet program in summer of '43, went through pre-flight, went to Vernon, Texas, about 30 miles from where I was born, and did at Victory Field, flew PT-19s, and the guys that just finished building this BT-13 are going to be starting on a PT-19 here momentarily. We'll take some trips up there to Anoka. He then went to Garden City, Kansas, and flew BT-13s. Then went down to Eagle Pass with T-6s, and graduated from gunnery school in T-6s to P-40s, and stayed in the gunnery school there for a while. He had an opportunity, and Harold, I'm going to stop here and have you, you had the opportunity to bring a plane up to the Twin Cities before you returned to Eagle Pass. Start there and tell that story of from there forward.
Okay. Just prior to that, excuse me, I had been instructing gunnery at Eagle Pass, and they had a lot of fighter pilots trained already, and they decided to close most of the fighter training schools, so that put me out of work. And then this incident that Colonel Patton mentioned, I was given an opportunity to ferry an airplane, one of those little spotter planes by Fort Riley to Minneapolis, and of course Mankato was just short of there, and I flew the airplane up there, stopped my hometown, gave a few airplane rides, and if you know anything about travel during World War II by train, it was miserable. So they had cut me a 15-day leave of travel leave, and after getting to Minneapolis with the airplane, I went back to Mankato, and then caught a train to San Antonio. You have no idea what it was like to travel on train from Minneapolis to San Antonio. They go this way and that, but by the time I got back to Eagle Pass, I got to San Antonio, got a bus to Eagle Pass on the border. And you know, all of my instructor buddies had shipped out to the last RTU, that's Replacement Training Unit, for P-51s. I'd been initially fighter pilot. So I'm hanging around there waiting for whatever came in. The first thing was glider pilot, and I really lucked out. Put it on your chin. I'll try to make this as quick as I can because I know you're all getting tired. But anyway, I dodged that glider pilot bullet, and the next thing that came up was third pilot on a B-29 flying backwards as an aircraft performance engineer. And I took it. It was a much better choice. So anyway, I went through a process of a total year of retraining because the job of engineer on a B-29 was so complex. You practically had to be, some people say, an electrical engineer, but it was most all electrical and very little, no hydraulics at all. And so what happened is that with this 1 year of retraining, I was deprived of getting shot at and shooting somebody else. And so I arrived on, well, first of all, after training, we ended up in Topeka picking up a new airplane and going out to Tucson for combat training, the B-29. And I arrived on Tinian Island on the day that they dropped the second bomb. So my only claim to fame is that hanging around there, I think it was 17th of August that I was scheduled to fly my first mission off Tinian, night mission, of course. And at the briefing, it was announced that the Japanese had decided to throw in the towel and they wanted to talk about it. So that was one big night of celebration for the people, myself included. But then after that, from the 17th of August until the signing of the peace on the 2nd of September, we had achieved grid coordinates for prisoner of war camps where these people were. And the B-29s were loaded up with containers with everything you could imagine, good things to eat and medicines and cigarettes and magazines and that sort of thing. So we flew up there to northern Honshu, and we finally found this camp. We must have overflown it once because when we got back, they had put a big sign on the roof, "Drop here." With a, and so we did our drops, and some of the people that were in that camp had been in the Bataan Death March that had gotten up there. And some of the guys on the airplane had put their name and address in there, and they later had heard from these POWs, which was a nice experience. But other than that, I know we were going to tell you about the day of the. He was talking about here about the black cloud over the Missouri. Well, I happened to be in a ship that comprised that black cloud over there, the B-29. And we were scheduled to rendezvous at 7,000 feet up there because we didn't fly up in formation. It took too much fuel. So we flew up individual. We were scheduled to rendezvous over Tokyo at a certain point at 7,000 feet. But the weather, we didn't have very good weather reporting in those days either. But so I think the ceiling might have been around 3,000 feet. So no, there was no plan B. Nobody had briefed a contingency plan for this. So what do? You know, we decided, let's go down on the deck and look this place over. So we took a tour of Tokyo and Yokohama, and I was saying here, there was nothing hardly left standing but a brick wall here and a fireplace there, and sort of, it was really, really a mess. But then at the appointed time that we were supposed to fly over the battleship Missouri, we tagged on to some other airplanes and made a pass over there. And we were low enough so I could easily see the sailors hanging off of gun barrels and everything else. And so that was rather exciting. But after that, I did get to spend a week on Iwo Jima. We went up there to navigate for the fighter outfit that was coming back to Guam.
And I'm going to add one other thing. Harold, in his flying career, logged 20,000 hours, if you can believe that, later. And that's a tribute. But I do want to go back to Brother Quentin, because this is something that I want all of us to keep an eye on. Quentin was on the USS Oklahoma. If you remember, the Oklahoma at Pearl Harbor overturned, and the people died in the hull. And it took a couple of years to get the bodies out, and they were buried in, I guess the name is common graves, is it? No, I'm talking about they were buried multiple bodies together.
Yeah.
And with the advent of DNA, they're now starting to dig those up. And can you tell us about what's going to be happening to Quentin?
Well, the reason I happened to be here is Sergeant Neal over here got in touch with Colonel Don that he'd seen this article in the Minneapolis paper, and there was a picture of 3 young men there. I was 16 at the time. My brother Quentin was 20, and my brother Earl in the middle was 18. So the story in the paper was that Quentin's remains had been identified and they'd be returning him for burial. Now we're anticipating a call sometime in the next month or so from these people who will come with a team to bring the flag and any decorations they had coming. So I know. you people are getting tired. I don't want to keep you much longer, but that
No, you
was,
finish. You finish.
Let me go back to something that I think you might find interesting to know, and some of you might have lived through this. I was 17 years old on a Sunday, 21st of December 1941. We knew that Quentin was on that Oklahoma, but we had no way of knowing what his fate was. We were just having Sunday dinner and the phone rang. Normally the Western Union delivered telegrams by bicycle, and it was a very stormy day. And they asked, we have a telegram from the War Department for Mr. Gifford, would you take it? And I got my dad. My dad was 46 years old at that time, and Quentin was his firstborn. You can imagine what happened. My dad got the message, his knees buckled underneath him, you know. It was very sad. My mother was an invalid. She was weeping, and well, that was the beginning of the dilemma. And of course, everybody in those days had this feeling that we're going to see him walk in the door someday, that there's been some big mistake. Maybe he was injured and lost his memory or something. But I owe everything that ever happened to me good in my life. I had the most interesting career in aviation, all due to listening to the advice of my brother. When he came home on leave, 1940, I had quit high school. He said, please, he says, I know, go back to school, finish high school, and after the war, we'll together go to college. So I promised, and I went back, and I worked real hard. It was by virtue of that I was able to pass the exam. You know, initially they required 2 years of college to get into the officer cadet program. And just by virtue of taking my brother's advice, I qualified and was admitted into the Army Air Corps cadet program. So since that, I had gotten into a career in aviation, which was probably one of the most interesting things a guy could do in his lifetime, because I had so many different things to do. But I had an opportunity to fly the Minneapolis Lakers around, and you probably heard of them, and they became the Los Angeles Lakers. But I've written a book about what we call the miracle landing, because I'll give you just a very brief shot. We took off from St. Louis January 17th, 1960. 23 on board an old DC-3. Now this thing only had 75 amp generators on it. You buy a Bonanza today, it's got 350 amps. So we take off 23 on board in this old airplane. There's a young guy that's getting checked out as co-pilot. It's 21-year-old Jim Holsdingle from up north here. We take off. Bad weather. It was 303/4 with a little bit of light freezing drizzle. We got airborne. I got the gear up, and all of a sudden, lights went out. Blinked a little bit, went out, and it's dark. And we sat there in the dark. It was very fortunate that the manufacturer had installed a vacuum-driven artificial horizon, which we could keep the airplane, going where it should. We had a magnetic compass. We had no radios or anything. But I won't tell you the rest of the story, except I'll say that 5 hours and 40 minutes later, these 23 people, including myself, didn't know if they're going to live or die. We landed in a cornfield in northern Iowa in a snowstorm, And I'll tell you what, when that airplane touched the ground and we cut those engines, you never heard so much screaming and applauding and stuff. And all these players got out, and they were out there throwing snowballs. Now, get this. The first responders, we'd circled this town several times, The first responders heard all this hollering and shouting. They thought, oh, my God, this is terrible. These people are dying. And they were really amazed when these basketball players come tripping through the snow.
But you can buy the book at the counter, and but anyway, Quentin, we're going to keep an eye on Quentin, and we're going to have some people come out and celebrate his remains coming from the Punch Bowl to Minneapolis.
It'll be announced. Excuse me. It'll be announced in the local paper. I'm sure the capitalize on the publicity, and there'll be a service. And
Well, listen, we got to stop here. I'm going to take this out. If there's a question or two, I see a hand across the way. I'm coming over. This will be the only question if you'll wait for the microphone.
ran over my 5 minutes.
A question I've always been curious about is the Pacific Fleet has always been my favorite. But whenever June 6th comes up, they keep talking about the Great Armada that was launched against Normandy. But the Pacific Fleet was a hell of a lot more powerful than that one. What's the discrepancy? Or, how come we keep hearing about the Great Armada and the Pacific Fleet is just barely even mentioned? They were at sea at the same time.
Yeah, the Marianas operation was often referred to as the other D-Day. It went off 9 days after the landings in Normandy. The European theater always got more attention because, more people have an acquaintance with the European continent and its cities. 40% of Americans have, well over half have European heritage. Their capital. We visited the nature of the alliance. I think there was a lot of news attention to the bargaining between the UK and the US about when cross-channel landings will take place. So when it finally did go off, the correspondents were on hand to cover it. The distances of the Pacific allowed no such thing, and that's ultimately what makes your point, is that the accomplishment of Operation Forager, the invasion of Saipan, was technically far more impressive than the Normandy landings. I'm sorry to any veterans of the European theater here. We took Saipan from staging from 1,000 miles to the east at Eniwetok, and to coordinate the delivery of multiple divisions over that distance was really an impressive feat of power projection based on a foundation of sea control that had to be hard won over months and years. And so, yeah, no, I agree with you.
Well, listen, we're going to break. We've run long, but it's been great.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.